Good evening and welcome to another edition of Bible Topics. This evening I'm joined by a very special guest. This is Andy Bannister, who is the director of Solas Centre for Public Christianity. I think I got that right.
You got that absolutely right first time, Regan. Well done.
Wonderful, wonderful. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Andy.
So I'm a Londoner, kind of originally, but I've been all over the place. So born and raised in London. Grew up in a good Baptist home. You don't have to be a Baptist to go to heaven, but why take chances?
We just both happen to be in the same boat.
What an exciting coincidence. And then really sort of came to a personal faith in my teens. But very, I think, early on in my sort of walk with Christ, really began sort of wrestling with, how do we help our friends who don't have a faith and the questions that they have. How can we share our faith with those who are outside the church? That was something that became an interest to me as a young Christian. And then really as I moved initially through secular work and then into ministry, that's been a thread through the last kind of 30 years. So Solas, the organisation that you mentioned, they're based originally in Scotland. Solas is the Gaelic word, the Scottish word for light. And we really do two things. We take the gospel out of the four walls of the churches and help churches put on events in coffee shops and pubs and restaurants, universities. And then the other half of it is helping equip Christians to feel more confident in sharing their faith with their friends. And so that's Solas's passion, that's my passion. So yeah, I love doing Christian stuff like this, but I also love getting out and addressing hostile crowds, skeptical crowds, people that don't have a faith, don't realise why they need a faith. It's great fun.
Well, that's fantastic. Andy, when you were working in the secular world,
Yes.
Did you consider yourself an accomplished evangelist as such?
That is potentially understatement of the, or overstatement of the year of going. So I worked for the health service, I worked for the NHS, I worked for a wonderful place called St George's Hospital in South London.
Tooting.
Very good. Do you know how did you know that?
I know it because my family, some of them are moving to Wimbledon. So.
Oh, amazing.
And
so
I have a friend who used to work there, so I visited.
Well, it's even more fun than that. I was born there. So I was born in that hospital.
I've walked the halls of the hospital where you were born.
There you go. Born there in 1972, started working there in 1992. And I worked there for about 6 years helping them do medical conferences. So I was doing administration. And I would say during that period of my life, Regan, I was what I call an undercover Christian, which I've long thought would make a great movie title, actually, about, Christians sneaking around at work or at school, trying not to get outed for actually having a faith. In fact, when the TV series Silent Witness was announced a few years ago, I thought, they've done it. That's got to be about Christians trying to hide away from scrutiny. And what I mean,
got your backstory there.
Yeah, so the undercover Christian thing, by that what I mean was, at that stage in my life, I think outside of work, I was a very active Christian, very actively involved in church. I was involved in youth work and very, very committed to my faith. Inside work, I took my little light of faith and I put it under a bowl, put the bowl inside the box, put a box behind blackout curtains. Nobody was going to find out I was a Christian. And I think what was going on was I was afraid. I was afraid that if I try and talk about my faith in the workplace, I might look like an idiot. Mm-hmm. I might make God look like an idiot. This might affect my career. I might stand out from the crowd, and workplaces can be very conformist environments, right? And then I think the other issue that held me back was if I talk about my faith at work, what happens if I'm asked a question I can't answer? What happens if somebody asks about science or suffering or sexuality or a topic that doesn't begin with the letter S? What would I do? And those fears kept my mouth shut during that stage of my life.
Did you forever keep your mouth shut?
Well, thankfully no, and obviously because otherwise I wouldn't be doing the job that I was doing today. I think a few things happened. I think one of the big things that happened was coming across Christian friends who were doing really good natural jobs of sharing their faith at work, at school with their mates, watching them and going, oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting way of doing it. Because I think one of the things I'd grown up with was the idea that if you are going to be an evangelist, a communicator of the gospel, you have to have this big stage and a big presence. I remember going and hearing Billy Graham speak in 1989 at Crystal Palace and coming away both incredibly impressed, but also frankly terrified. Because, well, I can't do what that guy does, so I can't do this. But then coming across Christian friends who were sharing their faith just naturally in conversations through their friendships, going, okay, that's a whole different way of doing it. And now, interestingly, Solas, the organisation I lead, although yes, I'm a public evangelist, I'm not a Billy Graham type of person. A lot of the events we do with churches up and down the country, we're getting 60, 70, 80 people, smaller crowds, pub room size, restaurant room size, university lunch bars, these kind of things. And I like that size of crowd because you can be that bit more intimate, a bit more personal, rather than being sort of on a big stage with a huge PA system.
Definitely. So would you say that interacting with those Christian friends who were being faithful in the workplace served as a catalyst of change for you, or was there another moment that you would say that was the moment when things began to change?
Yeah, I would say it was two things, Regan. Firstly was interacting with folks like that and learning from others. And I say that to people listening to this, who perhaps, if you're a Christian listening to this, and you're a bit nervous about sharing your faith, a great starting point is, okay, why not look around you in your church and your local Christian community? Who do you see sharing their faith? And what are some of the ways that they're doing it? And are there things you can learn from them? Or could you tag along? Or could you get them to pray for you? If you want to be sharing your faith in your workplace, it can be really helpful to have older, wiser Christians who are committed to praying for you, that you can share the successes, the failures, who can encourage you, and so on and so forth. If you try and do it entirely on your own, you're going to end up feeling very lonely and stressed out. But then the other thing that really happened was there was a common thread I noticed in a lot of my friends who were having really good one-to-one conversations with their friends. And it's best illustrated, I think, by a story, actually. I had a friend of mine who was a GP called Peter a few years ago. And Peter told me one occasion, he said, I love being a Christian and being a GP. So many wonderful opportunities for evangelism. And he told me how he was sharing his faith with his patients, praying with patients, and even led some to Christ right in his surgery. I remember thinking, hang on, this is amazing. How are you doing this, not getting fired? Because you probably know, like I do, right? Lots of Christian medics and public service professionals terrified, right, about sharing their faith at work. And we were talking earlier, I think you were involved in the past with Christian Concern, other organisations like that do a great job supporting Christians in those situations. Well, how was Peter doing it? So I asked him. He said, well, Andy, when I have a patient in my consulting room who's got something going on in their life, he said, I'll take them on a little life audit. I'll say something like, tell me about your diet. Are you exercising well? Tell me about your sleep. You're sleeping well. Tell me about exercise. Are you exercising properly? And so the last question I'll always ask is, tell me about spirituality. You're making space for that in your life. And he said, usually they'll say, what do you mean, doctor? And Peter will say, well, some people meditate, some people do yoga. I'm a Christian, though. I read the Bible, pray, go to church, those kind of things. And he said, in the vast majority of cases, the patient will say, you pray, doctor, or you read the Bible, doctor. What's all that about then? Well, they're now asking him, and he is infinitely freer to talk in response to their questions. And what Peter was doing was he'd figured out the power of questions. And I suddenly noticed all my other friends that I'd been inspired by were finding ways to provoke questions or to ask questions in their conversations. And what gets exciting is when you turn to the Gospels and you see how Jesus had conversations, right? Jesus asks 307 questions.
Wow. In
the Gospels. Questions, I think, are the key to really easy, lower risk interpersonal evangelism. We often think we have to memorize methods and arguments and techniques. We need to learn to be good question askers.
Don't you think that also entails being good listeners and being able to respond helpfully either with other questions to get people thinking or...
Yeah. Sorry, you were saying I didn't listen there.
It caught me.
Yeah, it does. And there's a whole lot more that can be said about that in the book I've written recently, How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. That book is really about questions. Yeah, I think questions get you listening. And sometimes as Christians, we can do a little bit too much talking. And I think in a conversation with a friend, it can be helpful to be thinking the other person should be doing at least half the talking here. The other thing that questions do, they force you to take an interest in people. And the more you take an interest in someone, the more, I think, naturally you're going to build a rapport. And by the way, that's a great place to practice starting evangelism. If you are very nervous listening to this, I will go, what about set yourself the challenge of, in my day-to-day interactions with the postman, with the guy I buy my milk from at the corner shop, if I buy my big issue off the big issue seller on the street corner, the taxi driver, whoever it is, what about I set myself the task of trying to learn a bit more about their lives? Don't just do the interchange. Ask them how their day is going. Ask about their family. Find out about their lives. The more we learn to take that interest in other people, they will naturally take an interest in your life, and that creates amazing gospel opportunities. Questions do that. And then lastly, Regan, I'd say questions take the pressure off you. If you sit there thinking, I have to have all these amazing answers, I have to be able to present the gospel so beautifully and winsomely, and if they ask a question of me, I have to have this amazing theological answer ready to go, that pressure will destroy you quite probably. But if you're like, okay, My task is to listen, to be praying and thinking, what's a good follow-up question here to lead folks through the conversation. It deprofessionalizes it. You can have it's much easier to have those natural conversations, even if you're someone who's been a Christian for 6 days.
I'm already hearing a little bit of, just from what I know of people, the objections to what you're saying. And one of these that I've heard before is, well, I just don't think that the workplace is an appropriate place to be bringing my personal views and beliefs and faith, which I hold very sincerely and dearly, into. I feel that that's not really a great environment to do that. How would you respond?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, the funny thing is, Regan, 5-10 years ago, that argument might have held more force. Now, the big mantra we hear from the HR departments of many large companies is, people need to be encouraged to bring their whole self to work. That is the phrase that's used. And so our friends in, say, the LGBT plus community are encouraged to bring that, that rainbow, sort of extravagance into the workplace. People, green issues, people are encouraged to, if you're into ecology, bring all that into the workplace. Bring your whole self to work is the phrase that's used. And so the first thing I'd say, well, for us as Christians, who our faith is central to who we are, then we too should be encouraged, I think, to bring our whole self to work. And by the way, we extend the same courtesy to our friends in other faiths. And I'll often say to people, our Muslim friends, their faith is everything to them. It's not fair to equally to them to say, yeah, if you're a member of the LGBT community, your identity is welcome in the workplace. By the way, if you're a Muslim immigrant here, no, just shut up. That's not right either. And that gives Christians this tremendous space.
Yeah, that's very good.
So the main thing I would say there is, don't ask of ourselves or demand for ourselves anything we don't equally extend to others. And that actually plays very well in the workplace. I remember a few years ago, a friend of mine who works for the, I think it was a council up in the Midlands, he and a few other Christians decided they wanted to get the Alpha course going in their workplace. And so they knew they had to go to HR. And so they worked out this whole presentation around inclusion and diversity, went to the HR manager and said, could we launch the Alpha course? And he said it was amazing because we played the right cards and we did it all under EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion. They loved the idea. The only caveat, I love this, the only caveat on the Alpha course was, we'd love you to do this, but of course it does need to be open to more than just Christians. To which Steve was like, yes, we'd love to invite everybody. And then the HR director went, brilliant. Would you like us to put an advert for you into the company email that goes organization-wide? And again, because they'd come under that, we want to welcome others. We want everyone to be free to talk about these big questions. There was no problem at all from HR.
That's wonderful. Now, how true do you think it is that perhaps when we, I'm sure you may know where I'm going with this. Do you think that there are occasions when we might be too concerned about people thinking we're an idiot for following Jesus?
Absolutely.
So we are concerned what people think about us.
Yeah, let me say two things here that are really important. Most people who've seen the book title, How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot, have loved it, which is great, because I can say it's a brilliant book title because I didn't think of it. Yeah. I was doing a seminar in Canada almost 10 years ago now, and it had some really boring title they've given me, like How to Speak in a Winsome Way About Your Faith in Workplace and University Environments. And I was like, yeah, come on. So we jumped on a conference call, myself and 2 or 3 pastors from the organising churches, and sort of together, I can't remember who came up with the title. I don't think it was me. One of the pastors was like, well, quite frankly, the thing we're talking about is how to share your faith without being an idiot. And I was like, that is the title. And then later it became a book. I love the title. My one caveat is, some people have gently raised the question, Andy, doesn't the Bible talk about being a fool for Christ? Paul talks about this. And I'm like, yes, that's a really good response. And I would say 2 things. I think the first thing is there's a difference between being a fool and an idiot. Demonstrated by the fact, if I said to you, Regan, people are going to think badly of you, or I'm going to think badly of you, you've got a choice. You can either look like a fool this afternoon, or you can look like an idiot this afternoon. Right. Which would you pick? Most of us will pick fool, I think. Because fool, I think it's not quite as strong, it's not quite as utterly inane, it's
a picture of a court jester, a bit of a clown.
There's some of that too, that people might go, yeah, interesting. And as you say, that's got that connotation too. So I think there is a difference there. But the other thing too that I think is serious here is I talk in the book about the fears that can hold us back from evangelism. I talked about some of them in my workplace setting, right? Particularly fear of what people think of you, fear of standing out from the crowd. Do you know one thing that's interesting about fears can reveal our idols, right? If you are constantly in fear that your bank account's going to run out and you're going to end up with financial problems, okay, you know, make wise financial decisions, right? But that fear, if it dominates, actually reveals that your idol is money and security. The center of your life is not Christ. If you're constantly worried about what your friends think about you, at one level that's natural, I get that. If it becomes all controlling and shuts down you talking about Christ all the time, then maybe actually reputation and image has become an idol. And probably that was true for me in my 20s in the workplace. I wanted people to think well of me. I wanted to be thought of as a helpful person around, as a model colleague, because promotion and so on. And I think looking back now, that had become a little bit of an idol. So yeah, we need to address that reality and be serious in it.
And you mentioned earlier there's a degree in which you're concerned that it's not just about you looking like an idiot, but you don't want people to look at God and think, what? You know, and you don't want people to basically start taking the mick out of God because you've horribly represented him. And so I think that's where some people may think, well, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I ask the wrong thing? What if I overstep? What if I say the right thing in the wrong way? And we can perhaps overthink all of this rather than finding a peace in what the Lord promised. He even said, you know, they're going to drag you before courts. And in that day, don't worry about what you're going to say. I'll give you the words. Now, with the caveat, sometimes maybe we should be a little prepared. You know, we should have in our mind something, or else we could just blurt out some nonsense that's not necessarily right or helpful. But what are some things that we can do that really help people open up to the possibility? I know in your book, How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot, there are 4 questions that you outline that help people really open up and facilitate meaningful conversation.
Well, the first thing I'd say, we'll come to those questions in just a moment. I think a great place to begin actually is prayer.
Yes.
Now, we all know this to be the case, but sometimes I don't think we pray perhaps in an informed, sort of organised way. One way we can do that for evangelism, the exercise I introduced in the book, is it can be really helpful to make a list of the people in our lives that we're interacting with. Put that somewhere you're going to see it regularly, the front of your Bible, stick it to the kettle, the cat, you know, somewhere you're going to see regularly. And then pray intentionally. Pray, you know, Lord, would you open up opportunities? Because you say we are promised that God will give us the words to say, and we also know that God creates opportunities. I love, you know, particularly the book of Acts. It's full of these sort of little divine encounters. Think of, you know, sort of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch is a good one. He happens to be in just the right place at the right time as the chariot goes by when the guy is reading from the scroll of Isaiah. I mean, to go, that is a heck of a lot of coincidences, because our God is the God of coincidences. And I think the more we pray, the more you begin to see those divine coincidences open up. You know, we had an example of this recently in our own family life, where there's a family in our street we've been getting to know a little bit. They've got some situations going on, and we've been praying for them a bit. And then, literally out of the blue, the woman in this household, it's a young lad in his almost sort of 11, 12 years old, lives with his granny. The granny was talking to my wife, and out of the blue, she said, "Have you guys been praying for us?" I know, that was my, that was my reaction to go, what? Well, that was certainly my wife's reaction. And then because there'd been some quite significant change in a situation, and she'd obviously figured out we were Christians, and so, but I have never had that question, and so my wife Astrid was like, yeah, we have. And a lot of stuff opened up, and that conversation's ongoing. But I'm convinced that coincidence happened because we've been praying for that family. So I would say begin with prayer is a good thing. Secondly, questions, and as you say, having some questions in your armory, because I don't think there are some really crass questions, but I think if you are a caring person, you love your friends and colleagues, you pray intentionally, and you're really trying not to cause a gratuitous offence, that lowers the chances that you will. And by the way, if you do, apologies go a long way. Just say, I'm really sorry if I upset you by that. Do apologise. Most people will go, yeah. So the question I teach in the book, let's start with, there's 4 of them, so maybe we should take them one by one. The first one is what I call the what do you mean by that question. That question, Regan, is really useful if you're afraid that someone's going to throw a big issue at you when you identify as a Christian or bring Christian things up, it can be helpful to navigate that conversation. So, for example, if you mentioned to a work colleague that you went to church on Sunday and your colleague's, oh, good grief, why would anyone believe in God? Science has disproven God. Quite a common objection we hear in today's secular culture. And again, it can cause you to freeze in panic, like the rabbit in the headlines. What do I do? I'm not a scientist. How do I answer? Well, a great way to begin is just begin by saying, that's really interesting. What do you mean by that? Can you help me unpack that? How exactly has science disproven God? Now, there's every chance, probably, there's a 94.2% chance. In fact, just remember that 47.3% of all statistics are made up on the spot. It's probably a higher than 90% chance that your colleague is going to go, oh, well, I haven't really thought about that, because they've just heard somebody say that on the media. They've heard Richard Dawkins or Ricky Gervais or something say that.
They've regurgitating
it. And you're not trying to do a gotcha. Yeah. You're just digging a little bit deeper. And what you're doing, probably stuff will come out here. Now, what's really interesting, be prepared for quite surprising stuff to come out. I remember teaching some material from this book to a youth group a few years ago. Taught these questions. A couple of days later, I got an email from one of the youth leaders to tell me that the day after I taught the kids this stuff, one of the 14-year-olds was in school, was in a science class. One of his fellow students says, oh, you're a Christian, what are you doing in a science lab? Christians don't believe in science. This kid, having been in my class the day before, said, that's interesting. What do you mean by that? And what then happened, apparently, it turned out this fellow student, he had lost a loved one to cancer a week or two before, was really seething with anger at God and just looking for the first Christian to lash out. It was nothing to do with God and science. And actually, as he opened up that question, very quickly the stuff came bubbling up. And this Christian student was able to have quite a meaningful conversation with his classmate just by asking them, what do you mean by that question? So what do you mean by that question picks up on something your friend has said, and you get them to clarify it and dig into it a little bit. And there's lots of examples of how you can do that in the book.
I remember having a job for a while as a sales representative for a gym, and first individual I met, remember him clearly to this day, remember his name and everything, one of very few people whose names I remember from that job. He asked, tell me a bit about yourself. I did, and I actually really do encourage when people say, tell me a little bit about yourself at a new job or something like that as you're introducing. If we are who we claim to be and our identity is in Christ and so wrapped up in the salvation and redemption that He brings, that's a prime opportunity to go through the list and, speak of yourself as Christ follower, as a Christian, someone who, this is include going to church as part of those things that you're interested in. Well, there's all manner of things you can say there. But right off the bat, without missing a beat, he begins to give me his theory of God. And it was something as crass as there were a group of cavemen-like people huddled around a fire, and there was a massive storm, and they had to come up with some explanations. They just came up with God. And I said, oh, something very much like that. That's really interesting. Where did you come across that?
Yes.
And it was at that point that he realized, okay, I can't just live in my own made-up reality.
That's right.
I actually have to have something that points to that moment. I can't say this is what I believe really and meaningfully without having some grounding in an objectively provable occurrence.
Interesting, eh? Yeah, by the way, I'm so glad you mentioned that identifying as a Christian. 2 tips I would give, even before we got to the questions, alongside the question stuff for Christians in the workplace or in new social settings or whatever. I think 2 ways you can sow the seeds for conversations. When you're in a new group, always include the fact you're a Christian. So, if you're in a new workplace or you started a new gym or whatever, someone asks who you are, talk about your family and what you're into, but just throw in there, I'm a Christian, go to whatever church around the corner. Even if that's all it is at that point, you have sown that seed, because the problem is every time that you move into that group without identifying as a Christian, it will get harder and harder and harder. And also, what are your colleagues going to think if 15 years after working in the office, you suddenly go, oh, I forgot to mention I'm a Christian? They're going to look at you and go, well, it clearly can't matter to you much. We've known you 15 years and now you only mention it. And the other golden opportunity many of us miss is the what did you do on the weekend conversation. Going to work on a Monday, your colleagues say, "Oh, how was your weekend, Regan?" And if you're a bit nervous, you go, "Well, okay, yeah, I had a great Saturday, played some sport, went to movies Saturday night, went to Sunday morning, and had a barbecue Sunday afternoon." You've missed an amazing opportunity. If you just talk naturally about church on Sunday, talk about the other stuff, but then include, went to church on Sunday, it's brilliant to hang out with other people who follow Jesus, so a pastor preached a really thoughtful sermon, still thinking about some of it, saw friends Sunday lunchtime. You've normalised church.
Yeah.
And you haven't been freaky, you've included in all the other normal things that people are familiar with. That does sow seeds. And from friends who've done this, and now I know how to do this and do more of this, it's amazing how people will then clock the fact that there's something going on here.
We make it so much more awkward than it needs to be.
We make it so much more awkward. So now interestingly, the example you gave with your friend at the gym, right, who threw the cavemen around the fire thing, that's interesting because that's taken us into the second question. So there's the what do you mean by that question, where you tend to pick up on a particular aspect of what someone said. Another good example of how you can use the what do you mean by that, by the way, is if someone says, "I don't believe in God," it'd be interesting to go, "Interesting, what do you mean by God? What's the word God mean to you?" Because I've asked atheist friends this and will sometimes hear back, "I don't believe in the man in the sky with the big beard and the lightning bolts." To which I go, "Well, that sounds more like some peculiar mashup of Father Christmas and Thor."
Don't believe that either.
But the next question is the why do you think that one? And that's really helpful, because just like your friend with the Flintstones, sitting around the fire thing, going, when you go, "Okay, what's your reasoning for that?" So if someone says to you, I think religion was invented by prehistoric cavemen, or I don't believe the Bible, it's full of myths and legends and superstitions, gently saying, "Okay, it's interesting. What is it that you've read or seen or heard that's led you to that conclusion?" Because sometimes in conversations with our friends, we get it into our heads, and our secular friends get it into their heads that their job is to sit there just throwing stones, and our job is to do all the answering. But to turn the table slightly, to use a biblical metaphor, going, I'm very willing to give reasons for what I believe, but you need to as well. And the why do you think that question is very helpful. It's helpful to an ethics, by the way, as well, gently. So if you're talking about spiritual things and say someone raises perhaps LGBT issues, that's one of those issues in the workplace, loads of Christians are terrified, right? Your friend looks at you and goes, "Oh, you Christians, you all hate gay people. How can I take you seriously?" And that's a terrifying question for many of us. How do I even begin? Well, it's interesting to say, okay, so firstly, by the way, I don't think that is, as a Christian, I don't think I hate people in that community. We may disagree on some things, but tell me, you would be, in favour of gay marriage and LGBT, equality, all those kind of things. Do you think that's a good thing? And then your colleague, of course, will go, "Yes." Go, "Interesting. Of course, that's an ethical position you've set out there. Tell me, how did you arrive at that conclusion? What's the kind of thinking and studying you've done that's led you to that ethical position that you lay out?" Because as a Christian, I think all people deserve equality and dignity. I can give you reasons why I think that's the case, but they're biblical reasons. Help me understand where you're coming from as a secular person. That sort of defangs the conversation, because you're not now into where do we stand on gay rights or whatever. We're into what's the foundation. And I remember a few years ago doing a dialogue on a Christian radio station with a gentleman called Peter Tatchell.
Yes.
Very well-known, gay rights activist. And the dialogue we had was on human rights. And it was fascinating, because my job was simply to challenge Peter on, so where's the basis for this belief in human rights and value and dignity that you have? And it was staggering. He had none. He simply kept back to, well, these things, human rights just exist. I was like, I don't think that works, Peter, with respect. And as a Christian, I believe in human rights and value because I have Genesis chapter 1. All God created human beings in his image. Male and female, he created them. That gives me a tremendous foundation, but you don't appear to have one. And we had a whole dialogue around the why do you think that question. And it was great. We didn't go anywhere near the fact we disagreed profoundly on what marriage is. We had an hour's constructive conversation on what are your foundations. So the why do you think that question is very helpful.
The one that comes up a great deal, even among some professing Christians, involves use of this word religion.
Yes.
And people will throw this out there, "Oh, I hate religion," or "I don't want anything to do with religion." We had a Facebook post at the Angel Church recently just inviting people to consider who Jesus is to them and interacting with an upcoming sermon series. And there were quite a few comments from people in the nearby vicinity who were talking about, "I don't want anything to to do with religion, or this is just more religious rubbish and stuff. And the one that really throws people off is, okay, well, what do you mean by religion?
Oh my word, yes.
Because of course, if you're talking about a list of rites and rituals that have no meaning necessarily, or that are just about making us feel better about ourselves, or that if you're thinking about, well, religion's all about control, you hear that. Religion's all about money, isn't it? George Orwell said, if you want to make money, make a religion, something like that. Napoleon said it's good stuff for keeping the common people quiet. And you can think of all of these different things, maybe just Dawkins has spoken of it as a crutch to get through life. If you think it's just about cash, control, or coping, that's not my version of religion, and that's not what the Bible defines religion as. And then it's like, you're automatically like, what? What are you talking about? Well, I'm all in favor of religion, because we see that there is religion that is pure and acceptable to God, which is to care for widows and orphans in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Those are really worthy character traits, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of things you can do there. You're right. I think any way that you can break the script slightly can be helpful, and questions can do that. And again, if you want examples of this, Jesus does this all the time. The Pharisees want to take the conversation one way, he throws a question in, takes it another. My favourite example of this, because I use this whenever I teach this material in churches, I was doing an event just down the road last night on the book. And in Mark, it's in several of the Gospels, but the story in Mark's Gospel of Jesus and the rich young ruler. The young guy who comes to Jesus and goes, "Oh, good teacher, what must I do to be saved? Effectively, how do I get to heaven?" And then Jesus turns that whole conversation around with that question: "Why do you call me good?" It's an amazing question, and it just breaks the whole script. And then morality is off the table, and we discover this young man's issue is wealth and possessions. And I love the way that Jesus just used that innocent little question, "Why do you call me good? Only God is good," to just shatter the whole direction. And with the religion piece, you're absolutely right. I think you can ask people the question, what do you mean by religion? That becomes interesting. And again, if you know a little bit more, you can take that further. If someone says, people who believe in God, go, well, that's interesting. Buddhists don't believe in God. So are they not a religion then? So you definitely have godless religions. Right. You can even have some fun and go, what about systems of thought that people believe passionately? I mean, ecology and the green movement can become like a religion. I think some of the transgender movement today functions like a religion. People believe, if you believe that you have an internal soul that can be gendered differently to your biological sex, that's almost a religious belief. That's interesting just throw out there and get people thinking.
Yeah.
But then the other way I take it is not dissimilar to you, Regan. I was going to say to people, so interesting you dislike religion. Do you know that Jesus really hated religion? Or at least religion that was the things you describe? And most people are not aware of this. And then say, do you realize that most of the times that Jesus gets the most angry at people in the Gospels, it's at the religious leaders.
Right.
And then, see what's lovely here, I'm always looking for opportunities when I can say to somebody, hey, this conversation reminds me of something that Jesus did or said or a story he told. That's a natural opportunity to go, look, would you like me to show you? And then you can pick one of the examples in the Gospel where Jesus lets rip. I mean, the end of Matthew, with the woes that he calls down on the Pharisees, and go, I mean, these aren't just the bishops in the House of Lords. These guys are even bigger than that in their culture. And here's Jesus just letting rip. So Jesus would be inclined to agree with you. The other thing I think that's helpful here is also to say, have you ever wondered, which by the way leads me to this is the third and fourth questions in the book I introduced. There's what I call the wandering question and the whether question. It's like, have you ever wondered why it is that the first Christians, when they were sort of rooting around looking for a word to describe their new movement, they didn't pick the word religion. They could have gone for that word. They didn't pick that word. They picked the word gospel. Yeah. And the word gospel, is literally the English translation of the underlying, the Greek word euangelion, which means good news. First Christians picked the word good news. Interesting, right? They didn't describe Christianity as a religion or a moral code or some advice. They chose good news. And when someone says to you, I've got some great news, presumably the only thing you want to know is, well, what is it? Is it true? And does it mean what you think it means? And if those things all line up, then that's brilliant. And that's the way that Christianity is portrayed in the New Testament.
It's fantastic. A favorite passage is in John 4, where we see Jesus. He's learned that the Pharisees have heard that he's making and baptizing more disciples than John, and he goes to this particular place where Jacob's well is, a town of Samaria called Sychar, and there's this woman from Samaria. This is John 4, verse 7. She came to draw water. Jesus engages her normally,
Yes.
Give me a drink, for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? So he's already broken a cultural norm here. It says, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. So he said something slightly mysterious.
Yes,
and
to draw her in, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. The woman said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw water with and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it, as did his sons and his livestock. Jesus said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. The woman said to him, sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water. And, sometimes maybe we read this and we're reading it perhaps through into spiritual a way automatically. This conversation was happening in real life.
Real life, yeah.
And so there's a degree perhaps where this woman is maybe seeing it as some banter almost, or to some degree just having a conversation, batting it. This guy's promising much. She's heard it all before. She doesn't have a clue who this person is asking her for water at this point. Jesus then says, go call your husband and come here. The woman answered him, I have no husband. Jesus says to her, you are right in saying I have no husband. You've had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you've said is true. The woman said to him, sir, I perceive you're a prophet. She's beginning to say something
big is going on, right?
Yeah, but Jesus continues. She says, I perceive you're a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. And he goes on and unpacks, and it leads this woman to make this magnificent declaration that this is the Messiah. And she goes into the town.
So that's the bit I love as well, Regan, at the end. Yeah. She then trots off and brings the entire village.
It's great.
So there's so many things going on in that. I mean, first thing is, as you say, I love the fact that I think there is a bit of banter going on. And we can learn from Jesus here of going, sometimes where we go wrong, I think, in conversations with our friends, we go too serious immediately. Someone says, we walk out the front door, we see our next door neighbour, and our next door neighbour says, how are you? I'm great, thank you, because I am washed in the blood of the Lamb. And our neighbour's like, what is going on?
Who's this? There was just someone I knew who, the first tactic in street evangelism was to walk up to someone and say, are you ready for the Antichrist? Let's skip the good news and let's go right.
Which is sort of, you want to go 10 out of 10 for correct doctrine, but minus several hundred for actually building bridges.
Yeah.
And I love the fact we see both in, Jesus does this, the other person does this, by the way, is the Apostle Paul. I think one of the master classes in how to engage today's culture. Go read Acts 17 sometime when Paul is there in Athens, and he does this wonderful presentation based off the altar to the unknown God. And he starts by being very positive with the Athenians. I love the fact you guys are so religious. I saw these temples and statues. And he has some fun, I think. There's a little twinkle in his eye. And I even saw this statue to an unknown God. And off he goes. We see Jesus do similar things regularly in his encounters. I think he teases people gently. With the Pharisees he'll provoke, I think, because I think the attitude that Jesus took was, you folks should jolly well know better. Someone like the woman there at the well who doesn't have the ability to know better. By the way, as an aside, and this is such a great evangelism tool we have available to us recently. One of the great resources that's come out of, we were chatting before the show and, commenting that that's not a local accent. One of the great gifts that your country, America, has given to us recently, The Chosen, with that dramatization of the life of Jesus. We recently watched that episode with the woman at the well. They've done it so well pardon the pun. And I think with our friends who trying to get them to read the Bible, some of our friends will be open to it. Some might go, oh, I'm not sure. To go, hey, have you seen this great new, streaming show online which has taken the historical, life of Jesus and dramatized it? Check this episode out with this conversation that Jesus has. Because it's so biblical and it's so saturated in the scriptures. But I found that I'll have friends who are not quite yet ready to read the Bible because they think it's religious.
Right.
But I send them a link to a YouTube clip. They go, oh yeah, okay, I'll watch that. But I think you're right, there's so much in that story. We can't go wrong with coming back to how Jesus has conversations as well. And the other thing we see there is he starts where people are.
Yes.
Gets down to their level. One of my other favourite encounters in the gospel, in John's gospel, is the woman caught in adultery. So much going on there, but I just love how Jesus starts when he bends down and is doing the writing in the dust. Lots of commentators have torn their hair out, think, what was he writing? I don't think that's the point. I think he could have been doing tic-tac-toe, quite frankly. Yeah. He's down at her level. She's down in the dust, and he's now down in the dust. And I think meeting people where they're at, starting where our friends and colleagues are at, rather than expecting them to leap up to our level, we see that model repeatedly in the Gospels.
Absolutely. Now, those final two questions,
yes.
Walk us briefly through how we can apply those.
So look, the what do you mean by that and the why do you think that? That's great if you've got a skeptical friend who is perhaps pushing back at you. I don't like religion, faith and science, any of those big questions. Those two questions will help you stay in that conversation. But the problem I think many of us have, Regan, is our friends, our neighbours, our colleagues have no spiritual interest at all. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've got so many of my friends and neighbours, if you even try and mention religion or play the I'm not interested in God card. And how do you start spiritual conversations with those folks? Well, that's, I think, where the have you ever wondered question rides to the rescue. And what you're doing with a have you ever wondered question, you're looking for something your friend is already passionate about. Think back to that example I gave a moment ago, Paul in Athens in Acts 17. He's figured out the Athenians are very religious. He's seen this altar as the unknown God, and he's figured, I can start from there. Can't end there, but I can start there. And what you're doing with a have you ever wondered question, you're inviting your friend to consider, why does that thing care? Why do I care about that? And in our today's culture, one of the most obvious ways to do that is justice. I mentioned Peter Tatchell earlier in our conversation. If you've got a friend who cares deeply about justice, human rights, dignity, whatever, perhaps you're watching a TV news with your friend and Ukraine comes on and they're like, oh, I can't believe what Putin is doing in Ukraine. Being able to tell your friend, you seem very passionate about justice. And your friend goes, yeah, I really care about these things. Have you ever wondered why we care about justice? Why does it matter to us? I mean, ultimately, we're just atoms and particles in motion. Who cares what one configuration of carbon atoms does to another? But you seem to really care about justice. You can do the same things with things like beauty, truth, meaning, music. Why do we care about these things? The best way to illustrate this, I think, is if you get a chance watching this to go to the Solas website sometime, just Google my name and Solas, S-O-L-A-S. We have a whole series on the Solas website we've done the last year called Have You Ever Wondered? We're doing a book on it, based on it next year, where we've shown there's about 30 different themes there, where we've shown you can start by getting your friend wondering about the thing they care about, and then you can make connections to the gospel. It's a great way of starting spiritual conversations very gently with people.
That sounds wonderful. And that fifth question?
The fourth question even is the weather question. And that's not, hey, do you wonder why it's raining again today? To which the answer is, this is England, mate. The weather question is, I've learned over the years, rather than, bouncing up to our friends and go, do you know what, you're just wrong, atheism isn't true, you need to believe in Christianity. The barriers come up, they get a bit defensive.
You know what the Bible calls you?
Yes.
Fool.
Exactly.
Exactly.
That's a good start as well, yeah. Yes. But looking for opportunities to go in a conversation, hey, have you considered whether Christianity just makes a bit more sense of some of the things we've talked about? In the book, I told the story of a friend of mine who's a teacher down on the south coast of England, and he was teaching a class once of the secular high school on doing a class on human rights and justice. And he told the story of some human rights abuse and got the class thinking about it, and then he just said to the class, okay, this story we've all looked at, we all agree it's wrong, right? Yeah, so it's terrible. Okay, why is it wrong? What's happened to this individual? And he said it was fascinating. Ultimately, as he pushed his class, no one in the class could give him a reason as to why this thing they'd all agreed was terrible. And so John just went to and fro, got the discussion going, and then got to a point where he said, look, I just would invite you to consider whether, when it comes to human rights and dignity and justice, whether what you believe about God really matters. If you believe in God, it's much easier to talk about human rights because we can say God created human beings with value and dignity. They're precious in His sight. On the other hand, if you're an atheist in the room today and what you believe we are just the product of evolution, it's much harder to talk about human rights. I just would invite you to consider whether you want to think about the much bigger question of God to help you with this smaller question of justice. He said this led to this amazing conversation and conversations that followed with the kids in the weeks to come. And even more interesting, at the back of his class that day had been his head of department who was sitting there observing the lesson. And this opened up a really big conversation with his colleague later that afternoon in the staff room. And John hadn't stood there and gone, you need to be a Christian. He'd got fired if he'd done that. He'd simply said, I wonder whether you want to think a bit more about some of these bigger spiritual questions to answer this question that's right in front of you. And so the whether question, again, rather than say to our friends, you have to believe this, I wonder whether. And again, it's thoroughly biblical. But John's Gospel, where we were earlier, I love that moment where in John 1, where you've got the early window in some of the disciples, and there's that the dialogue between Philip and Nathaniel, where I think it's Philip says, we think we found the Messiah. Yeah. And Nathaniel's like, who is he? Jesus of Nazareth. Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? And the response is not, yes, of course you can, you idiot. It's like, well, why don't you come and see? Come and see whether it might be true. And that theme of come and see resounds through the Gospels as well. And it's a very invitational form of evangelism. Rather than me dinging you around the head, why don't you come and see whether Christianity might make more sense of the things that you care deeply about.
There's a lot of wisdom in that approach anyway. You can see, as far as we know, I don't think Gamaliel ever professed Christ as the Messiah, but Gamaliel had a real sense of wisdom in dealing with the Sanhedrin. And he said, look, guys, we're in danger. If this is of God, we're in danger of going against God. If it's not of God, then it's going to fizzle out. Let these guys be.
And see what happens.
See what happens, exactly. Yeah. And I do feel like there's so many options, so many times that we are going to look at and say, well, okay, it's this way, or, we're going to immediately do exactly what Jesus rebuked the disciples for and called down fire from heaven and, call some massive rebuke on these individuals. And that's something that I do believe stands out. I've seen people engage in the street because, of course, there is that sense of beyond the workplace, people do engage in direct evangelism and to varying degrees of faithfulness and fruit. But there have been occasions where I've felt something not right with the approach when maybe someone's over here snickering or laughing or taking the mick out of the preacher, and the flesh kicks in, and it's like, well, you won't be laughing in hell. I've heard that.
Yes.
It's like, I don't think that's the way to reach people.
I don't think it is. There is a time sometimes when God may call us to call somebody out directly. I'm totally open to that.
Absolutely.
But if it's simply because we're frustrated, again, Acts 17, we are explicitly told at the end of that passage, some people, scoffed. We're not told that Paul then threw stones at them. Some people scoffed. Some people, interestingly, said, we want to hear you again on this subject. So Paul had done a kind of, have you ever wondered whether, that actually maybe with the whole idol and temple thing you've got going on here, it's all lovely, but actually if there's a God, he is so much bigger. And he intrigues them enough, they're like, okay, we want to hear you again, come back again. And then we're also told a few believed. And those are the three responses I think we should expect to see when we're being faithful. Some will scoff, and it's our job to leave them to the Lord to deal with them. And again, be careful to write people off, because sometimes it's the scoffers who then fall. One of my heroes, like he is for many of us, C.S. Lewis. Right, we love C.S. Lewis. You Americans, I think, love him more than us Brits half the time. Yeah. We almost canonised him. But we forget Lewis was a hardcore atheist. He was a really hardcore atheist for the first 30 years of his life, vitriolically anti-God. And if you'd met Lewis aged about 27, 28, you'd have written that guy off as well. Clearly he's a mocker. God's got nothing for him. Well, it turns out the harder they come, the harder they fall. So just be careful. So some will mock. We should expect that. We should expect some of our friends to go, okay, all right, I'm not ready to do much more than say, okay, let's talk again on this. And then let's also openly believe that there will be some who God will, call to faith, through what we're doing. Right. And by the way, last thing here as well on that point, let's also remember, I think for almost every Christian I've come across, I'm sure this will be the case for you, it's the case for me, but the case for most of you watching at home, right, who are Christians, you won't become a Christian as a result of one person. There will be multiple people involved in that journey to Christ. And so when we're talking with our friends, don't assume it's my job, I've got to get this person across the finishing line, or they're doomed to eternal destruction. It may well be that God plans for you to sow some seed, then a year later God will bring another Christian across that person's path, and all these pieces will come together. Paul talks about this in Corinthians. One man plants, another person waters, another person reaps. So let's rejoice in the fact if I can play some small part in the journey and then let God use another brother or sister in Christ to bring my friend further down the line.
Absolutely, and I think that we should rejoice in that reality, that we can be faithful to fulfilling God's call in our life in that particular given place and time, but then to recognize that someone else may pick it up, and to trust that promise that the one who's begun a good work is faithful and just to complete it.
Absolutely.
Years later.
Yeah, and the great thing about that, Regan, it does two things. It puts the focus back on God and His providence and bringing all those threads together, and it takes the pressure off you. Because one thing I think, again, looking back those early days where we began this conversation, when I started out in the NHS, one of the other big spiritual mistakes I made was I think it's a lie that the enemy will always whisper into us. It's all down to you. It's down to you. You've got to do it. You've got to be so persuasive and so compelling and so clever that you drag your friend across that line into the kingdom. And if they don't respond, you are a terrible Christian. And to go, that will destroy you if you listen to that. If you turn that around and go, no, that is not what the Bible tells me. My job is to be faithful here and now, love my friend, love Jesus. I mean, Jesus, again, reduces the law to those two things. Love the Lord your God with your heart, your mind, and your soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you obey those two things and then be a faithful ambassador with the people God brings across your path and trust the Lord to take it from there, then amazing things happen. The pressure goes and evangelism begins to become a joy again rather than this crushing weight that can destroy you.
We cannot possibly think that London or just our current situation across the United Kingdom or wherever you are viewing this from is as bad as Corinth in the first century. A very pagan city filled with just state-sanctioned immorality right and left, just truly scandalous stuff going on, even in the church. And that should also give us a reminder that when we see scandals and when we see problems in the church, that we shouldn't be surprised when these challenges come, when these trials come.
Correct.
But
absolutely.
What we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, I think it's really, really helpful, that reminder that you've just given us. We're not making followers of ourselves.
Correct. Absolutely correct.
It's not. We do want people to be able to say, and perhaps we should be able to say, follow me as I follow Christ. But ultimately, we're not seeking to build our own kingdom. It's thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as in heaven. And so the church in Corinth was beginning to build up this cult of personality, which, I mean, just as an aside, that's where a lot of those scandals stem from, where we've built up cults of personality. It's where a lot of the hurt in churches stems from. But he says, there's jealousy and strife among you. Are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? Verse 4 of 1 Corinthians 3. For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not being merely human? What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. It's fantastic.
So good, isn't it? And what is interesting as well, what I get so excited about, as you pointed out, we can look around our culture, be it London, wherever we find ourselves, whatever country we're in, whatever community we're in, and we can despair at how difficult things are. But your point there about what that first century world was like, I mean, I look back and go, isn't it incredible? But the church grew from 120 frightened men and women just after the resurrection, hiding out in fear of the authorities, and within 300 years, they have become 50% of the Roman Empire. Those numbers come from the historian Rodney Stark, by the way. So, you know, good secular writer there.
Yeah.
And of going, that's incredible. In a world that was that pagan, that, you know, they didn't even know, but that world didn't even know about Christianity, didn't even know who Jesus was. So however difficult our context is, however sort of neo-pagan our culture is, we know that the gospel, for want of better words, better phrasing, works in a culture like this because we've seen that in history. So let's look back and get excited about how God's worked in a culture even more rotten than ours. And to go, we don't need to despair because the gospel is so much bigger than all of this. And we're not facing new challenges too. And by the way, one other thing there I think that's really helpful. Let's also look to our brothers and sisters in the church around the world because, you know, here in the UK and America and Western culture, sometimes I wonder whether Christians, we've become too used to doing evangelism from a place of power. You know, we've been the majority and we've been able to do evangelism to the minority with a kind of view of listen to us because we're in charge. That's changed. It's changed in the UK, it's changing fast in the US and Canada. But if we want to see what evangelism looks like from the margins and from below, look to what's gone on in China. Look to the way the gospel's spread throughout the Muslim world. You know, Iran now, the fastest growing church in the world is in Iran, where Christians who are not in power, they are the minority, are demonstrating what faithful gospel witness looks like. And it's a wonderful opportunity to learn from our friends in the global church lessons that we can use in evangelism right here in London, Birmingham, Manchester, major cities here in the UK.
Wonderful. Andy, thank you so much for joining me on this edition of Bible Topics. And viewers, thank you for joining us. I do want to ask you, please, to pick up a copy of How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. This is Andy's latest book. I think it will be very helpful for your Christian walk. And I do pray about what we've discussed. But that's it for this evening from myself and from Andy. God bless you, God keep you, God make His face to shine upon you and give you His peace. Step out and trust the Lord as you interact with people for His glory. Have a good evening.